This month looked like ESG regulation was getting easier. The EU talked about simpler rules. EUDR costs could fall by around 75%. ESRS data points are being dramatically reduced. Further in the US, the SEC moved closer to rolling back its climate disclosure rules. So is ESG compliance slowing down? Not really, because the deadlines are still being there. The systems are still being built, and companies are still being asked to prove what inside their products: packaging, supply chains, and carbon exposure. The clearest example of that tension is definitely the EUDR, because it shows just exactly what is happening across ESG regulations right now. The process may become simpler, but the obligation is still moving forward. And when we add the packaging and waste regulation, short PPWR, the picture becomes even clearer. This is no longer just about sustainability reporting. It's about product evidence, packaging evidence, supplier evidence, carbon evidence, and governance evidence. So in this update, we will look at the major ESG policy moves from the EU, China, and the US. Then we will go deeper on EUDR and PPWR, because together they show where ESG compliance is heading next. And we will finish with what companies should do now, what leadership needs to understand, and what to watch next month. At first, these updates may look disconnected from each other. One is about product data, one is about deforestation, one is about packaging, and one is about forced labor. One is about carbon pricing and another one about climate disclosure. But together they point in one direction. ESG compliance is becoming less about broad reporting and more about evidence companies can actually produce. Let's start with the broader EU direction. On the 28th April, the European Commission presented a communication on modernizing EU lawmaking. The broader goal is here to make EU laws clearer, simpler, better enforced, and more aligned with the needs of citizens and businesses. The Commission says it will work on simplicity by design, stronger, better regulation tools, and regulatory cleanup with faster enforcement. Further simplification proposals are in progress and are expected to generate at least 15 billion euros in recurring cost savings for businesses and administrations once they have been adopted by the co-legislators. That sounds like a broad policy message. And this sets up the main story we will come back to in the deep dive: EUDR and PPWR. Because these two rules show the real meaning of simplification. First, fewer unnecessary steps, but second, still a clear obligation to prove compliance and clearer expectations for companies. The digital product passport also moved forward. On 29th of April, the European Commission opened a consultation on the Digital Product Passport Registry under the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. The short DPP is a framework that will require companies to make standardized product lifecycle data digitally accessible across the supply chain. That can include information on materials, repairability, carbon footprint, and environmental impact. And by July 2026, the Commission plans to deploy a central DPP registry along with a public portal for searching and comparing product passport data. From February 2027 on, certain large batteries are expected to be the first products required to carry a passport. Other sectors, including textiles, aluminium, furniture, tires, and electronics, are expected to follow through 2030. That means product-level ESG data is moving from a future concept to a near-term compliance issue. Then came the EUDR simplification package. On the 4th of May, the Commission published a simplification review report on the revised EU deforestation regulation, together with further implementation measures. The expected compliance cost reduction is significant, around 75% compared to the original EUDR package. But the application dates did not change. For large and medium companies, the regulation applies from 30 December 2026, and for other micro and small enterprises, it applies from 30 June 2027. The reporting landscape also changed. On May 6, the Commission opened a one-month feedback period on the draft revised ESRS and a draft voluntary reporting standard, the VSME. Feedback was due by 3rd of June. The revised ESRS aimed to reduce mandatory data points by more than 60% and total data points by more than 70%. Reporting costs per company are expected to fall by more than 30%. But the core architecture remains. Double materiality still matters. Transition plans still refer to 1.5-degree alignment and whether targets are science-based. Additionally, the VSME standard introduces a value chain cap for companies with up to 1,000 employees. That could change how large companies request ESG data from smaller suppliers. The topic of forced labor also moved forward. The European Commission's first implementing regulation under the EU Forced Labor Regulation was published in the official journal and enters into force on 18th of May 2026. It establishes the forced labor module in the information and communication system for market surveillance. That means information exchange between the Commission and competent authorities and custom authorities is being built into the system. The EU Forced Labor Regulation itself starts applying from 14th December 2027. Carbon policy also moved. The EU, Brazil and China launched the Open Coalition on Compliance Carbon Markets. The goal is to strengthen the integrity, transparency and effectiveness of domestic carbon markets. CBAM also saw a new draft implementing regulation on how carbon prices are paid in third countries can reduce CBAM certificate obligations. Meanwhile, outside the EU, China introduced a new supply chain regulation. This regulation allows China to investigate and impose countermeasures on foreign entities seen as applying discriminatory measures against Chinese suppliers. That could create tension with Western due diligence frameworks, especially where China is treated as a high-risk sourcing country. CBAM also became more practical this month. On 28th of May, the Commission published an updated FAQ for the definite phase, which started on 1st of January 2026. The FAQ reflects the amended CBAM framework, included the 50-ton threshold per declarant and calendar year. It also confirms that imports of CBAM goods require authorized CBAM declarant status from 1st of January 2026, with applications submitted through the CBAM registry. It further gives practical clarifications on verification, production year and origin rules, Northern Ireland, EEA and EFTA, and traceability. So CBAM is not only just about the future certificate costs. It is becoming a live import registry and documentation issue. And ultimately, in the US, the SEC has now proposed to rescind its climate-related disclosure rules in their entirety. The proposal follows the SEC's earlier decision not to continue defending the rules in court and would formally remove the climate disclosure requirements through a new rulemaking process. So the month is not just moving in one direction. Some rules are becoming lighter, some are becoming more detailed, some others are becoming more enforceable, and further, some more are becoming more politically sensitive. The EUDR update is the headline many companies wanted to see. You might have heard about lower compliance costs, scope clarifications, IT system updates, and more exemptions. But this is also where companies need to be very careful, because simpler does not mean optional. On May 4th, the Commission published its simplification review report on the revised EU deforestation regulation together with further implementation measures. The Commission expects the measures to reduce annual compliance costs for companies subject to EUDR obligations by 75% compared with the original EUDR package. The package includes a simplified one-off declaration for micro and small primary operators, and it also includes updated automated application interfaces, a contingency plan for unplanned IT systems unavailability, and a new voluntary grouping feature. That sounds technical, but it matters, because for companies, EUDR compliance is not just a legal question. It's a data question, a supplier question, a product classification question, and a system question. This is where EUDR becomes more than a deforestation story. It becomes a preview of the company actions we will talk about next. How to manage supplier data, how to map product scope, how to assign internal ownership, and how to turn regulatory requirements into actual evidence. There are also important scope changes. Soluble coffee and certain palm oil derivatives are added. Leather and retreated tires are excluded. There are exemptions for product samples, packaging materials, used or second-hand products, and waste. But the key point is that the application dates have not changed. For large and medium companies and for micro and small enterprises in the timber sector, the regulation applies from 30 December 2026. For micro and small enterprises, it applies from 30 June 2027. So companies may have a simpler process, but they do not have a longer runway. Now let's look at one of the other major EU regulations, PPWR. The Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation entered into force on 11 February 2025. It will generally apply from 12 of August 2026. And its scope is broad. It regulates all packaging and all packaging waste, whether that packaging is used in or comes from industry, manufacturing, retail, distribution, offices, services or household. It covers all packaging and packaging waste, regardless of material of origin. So PPWR is not just a packaging team issue. It's a broad market rule for packaging placed on the EU market. It sets requirements for manufacturing, composition, and whether packaging is reusable or recoverable. It also includes packaging waste management and prevention measures. Guidelines and FAQs were published in March, which shows that implementation questions are already becoming more practical. For companies, PPWR raises a different version of the same questions as EUDR. With EUDR, the question is, can we prove where certain products and commodities come from? With PPWR, the question is, can we prove that our packaging meets the new rules on composition, recyclability, recycled content, labeling, reuse, and waste prevention? And this matters because the PPWR timeline is already taking shape. On 31st December 2026, the recycled content calculation methodology is expected. That will unlock planning for 2030 compliance. By 12 February 2027, national penalty rules must be in place. By 1st of January 2028, the Design for Recycling Delegated Act is expected to define A, B, and C recyclability grades. By 12 August 2028, material composition labeling will be required on all packaging. By 1st January 2029, deposit return systems must be operational. And by 1st January 2030, a major wave of obligation arrives. That includes recyclability grades, recycled content targets, single-use plastic format bans, and reuse targets. So the EUDR and PPWR message is simple. For EUDR, companies need to know where in scope products come from. For PPWR, they need to know what their packaging is made of, how it is designed, and whether it will meet the next wave of EU requirements. That is the shift. ESG compliance is moving closer to the product. And for teams working on the regulation, we have additional resources available, including webinars, white papers, and practical explainers blogs on EUDR and PPWR. You can find all the links in the video description. Now let's turn into what companies should actually do next. This is where the policy update becomes very practical. Because for companies, the question is not just what changed in the regulation. The real question is, what do we need to be able to prove, and who inside the business owns that proof? For EUDR, that starts with the product scope. Companies need to look again at which products are in scope, which products may now be excluded, and which products may be affected by the latest clarifications. The simplified process helps a lot, but it does not remove the need to understand the product, the supplier, and the origin information behind it. So the practical test is simple. If someone asks tomorrow, could we show where this product came from, which supplier was involved, and whether the required due diligence information is available? PPWR creates a similar challenge, but from the packaging side. Companies need to know what packaging they place on the EU market. What is it made of? How it is designed? Whether it can meet future recyclability rules? Whether labeling will need change? And whether recycled content or reuse requirements could affect packaging choices before 2030. This is not something that can sit only with sustainability. Packaging data may sit with procurement, product teams, regulatory affairs, suppliers, quality or marketing. So companies need to find out where that information lives now, before the deadlines make it urgent. The same logic applies to supplier ESG data. The ESRS and VSME updates suggest that companies should be more focused on proportionate in what they ask from suppliers, especially smaller size suppliers. The value chain cap means large companies may not be able to keep sending unlimited ESG questionnaires to smaller value chain partners. So this is a good moment to clean up supplier requests, not by asking less important questions, but by asking better ones. Questions that are actually tied to actual reporting needs, actual risk and actual business decisions. Forced labor is another area where companies should not wait for the final deadline. The EU forced labor regulation applies from 14 December 2027. But further guidance on the EU FLR is expected to be published in June this year. This means companies should use the time now to understand where forced labor risk may sit in their supply chains. Which products, which regions, which supplier tiers, and what processes exist when a concern is identified. Then there is the digital product passport. This is a reminder that product-level ESG data will need to become structured, searchable and usable. Not buried in PDFs, not scattered across different teams, not dependent on one person knowing where a supplier document was saved. Companies should start treating product sustainability data as part of their core data infrastructure. And finally, China's new supply chain security regulation adds another layer. Due diligence is becoming more sensitive, especially where Western expectations require enhanced scrutiny of suppliers, but local rules may view some practices as discriminatory. So supplier questionnaires, audit language, escalation processes and termination decisions may need more careful legal and governance review. This is the practical shift this month. Companies do not need to panic, but they do need to connect the dots. EUDR, PPWR, DPP, forced labor, ESRS, CBAM and China are not just separate regulatory updates. They are all asking companies to become better at one thing: knowing what is inside their product, where it came from, who supplied it, what evidence supports it, and who inside the business is responsible for it. For executives, the main issue is ownership. This month's update shows that ESG risk is no longer sitting in one team or one report. It's moving into product decisions, packaging choices, supplier management, import costs and custom processes, and also market access. So the boardroom question is not, do we have an ESG strategy? The better question is, do we know who owns the evidence? Who owns supplier data? Who owns product and packaging compliance? Who owns carbon cost exposure? Who owns forced labor escalation? And who reviews due diligence decisions when they create geopolitical risk? That is the shift. ESG is becoming an operating model issue. Companies that treat it only as a reporting may miss where the real risk is moving. The ability to place products on the market, respond to authorities, satisfy customers, and control costs. This month, I would watch 3 types of signal. The first is feedback. EUDR feedback closed on 1st of June. ESRS and VSME feedback closed on 3rd of June. And CBAM's draft carbon price rules are also open for consultation. These are the files where companies still have a chance to react before the next version becomes more settled. The second signal is implementation. PPWR generally applies from 12th of August 2026. The Digital Product Passport Registry is planned for July 2026. New guidance on the forced labor regulation is expected for June 2026. That tells us the machinery behind the rules is being built. The third signal is global divergence. China's supply chain security regulation may complicate supplier due diligence. So in the coming months, the important thing is not only which deadlines are next. It is what those deadlines are telling us. The rules are becoming more practical. The systems are becoming more and more defined, and companies are facing more pressure to prove compliance and not just to describe it. This is the shift to watch next month. ESG is becoming less about broad promises and more about proof. Thank you for watching this video. If you're working on EUDR, PPWR or ESG compliance more broadly, we have webinars, white papers and practical explainers linked in the description. And if this update was useful, subscribe to the IntegrityNext YouTube channel for next month's ESG update.